This is rather new for me, so don't treat me too harshly. I'm probably not as avid a reader as all of you because I'm too busy writing instead of reading. I do a lot of research, but it's not as enjoyable as reading, and I wish I could have the time to do more, but as I'm also involved in the theatre, that makes it a little bit difficult because then I'm reading plays instead of novels. So you're obviously much more experienced as our esteemed panel than I am at reading and discussing books, so I'm just going to leave it mostly up to them and then to you. So I'm not doing any work at all, really. So welcome to our panel, and one of the things about the Rosie Project I found, even in just asking people at work, had they read it, and a few people actually had read it, and I said to one person, did you like it, and the other person, did you like it, and we got some mixed answers. So I'm going to ask our panel, first of all, did you like, David, the Rosie Project?
To be honest with you, I struggled at the beginning. I was the second person to read in my house, and my wife is here tonight, and I'd heard her chuckling. And I thought, wow, we don't often read comedy, so I hit it, and I did struggle. I don't know whether I should develop it too much further at the moment, Vicky, but I struggled, I grew into it, and my book club knows I gave it my rating of 8 out of 10 at the end, so I enjoyed the Rosie Project.
All right, we're moving over to our left.
I loved the book. I just thought it was so funny and so interesting to explore just issues around what's normal and what's not normal. I just thought it was fantastic.
Yes, Lucinda.
I'm along the same lines as Jackie. I really enjoyed the book. I started laughing in the first couple of pages, so I found it very humorous. I think I kind of identified with some of the oddball ways of the the main character, so I really enjoyed it. And the character development through the story was very interesting.
Is that?
Yes, I liked it with some misgivings. I must confess I didn't laugh out loud once. Although I had a friend staying when I was reading it, and she read the first 2 pages and she was chuckling. So I don't know whether that says more about me than about the book. But I think it was a bit simplistic. I have some issues with the plot. It was a light read, it was a fluent read, but not a great novel, I'd say.
Well, I must admit that reading the first couple of pages, I thought, I'm not going to like this. But then I said to myself, I don't want to make a snap judgment. But normally when I pick up a book, I read the first couple of chapters. If it doesn't drag me in those first couple of chapters, I'm thinking, it's probably not for me. And I was hoping that this was not going to be what happened with this one. But I think my main issue was with the protagonist. And I'm guessing that that's probably what made me not dislike the book. I liked the easiness of the read, and I liked the concept of how he'd written the book and what he was aiming for, but I just really couldn't like him, and I think that put me off the book as an overall. But coming to the end of it, you realise, well, perhaps he did redeem himself. So, it's one of those things that, I think that reading is subjective at any time, and so many people can read the one book and have very different opinions, as we all obviously probably do, for different reasons. And this particular book, I felt, would not have grabbed me in the first couple of chapters, and therefore I might have put it back. But because I was coming here, I persevered. And I'm glad I persevered. So that's probably a lesson to me in the future, is to not give up so easily. Speaking about the relationships of the people in the book, I think is one of the things that really made you want to keep reading, is to find out more about those relationships. And David, what do you think, what was your main relationship avenue? Which of the characters did you want to know more about, as opposed to just going, oh, okay, move on?
Yes, clearly Don was a character to be followed. You had to follow Don if you're going to take on the book. And as a male, that sort of meant I know where I'm sitting here tonight. As a male, that became something a little more personal to you. So the way Don manoeuvred himself and trained himself almost, forced himself to cope with situations that weren't normally part of his repertoire, that was interesting. Whether it was realistic is another matter. But his relationship with Rosie, the appearance of various characters in the book, I could think of Daphne at the moment, her appearance, her vanishing and coming back later on. There were things that kept my interest going over and above just the story. And it's not really literature, if you wish, but there was an appeal to it. And I found I could force myself to find some depth to things that were happening. So, Don mainly. Thank you.
Tessa, what was your favourite relationship in the book?
My favourite relationship? Well, I wouldn't call it favourite, but I was interested in the Rosie character. I felt that as a psychology student, she seemed to display a rather dismal lack of her own understanding her own psychology, which I understand is also quite normal for psychology students.
It's the old thing of Dr. Heal myself.
That's right. I felt that she was incredibly unaware sometimes of her own hang-ups. I found her somewhat simplistic description of the relationship with Phil unsatisfying. Now, part of the problem here was that we see the entire story through the eyes only of Don. He's the reporter. He's the only reporter, although there is dialogue. So we have to bear that in mind. But I felt that for somebody of her age, she was 29 going on 30, and somebody of her intellect, she hadn't really worked terribly hard to understand her own parents. It came as a shock to me towards the end of the book to discover, I think almost to the penultimate page, that her father, as it turned out, had actually pulled her from the car in this accident where her mother had been the driver. Now, none of these complexities were pointed out to Don early. And I felt that was a major failing. So I think she ended up by irritating me. So that probably doesn't answer the question, but she's the one that worries me the most in the book.
Okay, Jacqueline, was there a relationship particularly did Jean factor into your...
I was going to say, well, I perhaps was going to go to the one I disliked the most, and that for me was Jean. For those of you, he's a womanizer. He's characterised by trying to sleep with a woman from every country, and he's got a map on he's a university professor, he's got a map, and he then goes about putting a pin in each country of every woman that he's slept with, and actively pursues that, in the sense that he's also married, and his wife has to put up with this sort of behaviour. And so for me, I sort of was really irritated, and also I sort of felt that he was so superior to Don, so he was sort of mentoring and pretending to be a friend to Don, but at the same time setting Don up for little failures along the way to maintain his superiority, if you like. And so it was a very interesting relationship between Jean, his sort of mentor, and Don, and then sort of trying to humanise Don, when in fact one would sort of say that Jean wasn't actually a very nice human at all. So for me, that I really disliked him, but it interested me, the relationship.
Oh, David, really, the male characters were not very likable.
I guess I'm with David. I really liked Don's character, but I think it was more about the way he dealt with his differences in whatever situation he is. Was to read a book about how you do things, but not actually interact with people. And his relationship with Claudia, Jean's wife, he didn't have any friends, and his friends were basically Claudia and Jean, and how he used that relationship with Claudia to move himself forward, but also how Claudia looked after him. So when they go away, she sent him clothes because she knew that he would not pack well. Those kind of subtle things. I really liked the relationship between those two. And she was the go-to person, and Jean was the user. So
Don was very fortunate. He was so close to Claudia, he could ring her at 2:30 in the morning and
That's
not panic over it.
Even though he thought
What's the matter, Claudia?
He thought it was 12:30.
He thought it was 11:30.
No.
that was those social inept things that
Yes.
was not good at. Oh, people go to sleep.
I must admit, I also liked Claudia. I felt sorry for her. Not sorry for her, but the relationship, I think alpha male was obviously Jean, and I think that his trying to pull the wool over Claudia's eye, because it became very clear to me that although he was telling Don what he was up to, and Don thought that Claudia knew that it was an open marriage, to me it seemed very much like Claudia didn't really have a clue that it was as open as it was, as Jean was making it, and so I felt miffed on her behalf.
And obviously Don did too by the end.
Yes, well, yes.
She did get her own back. Remember the chili sandwiches?
Yes, the chili sandwich she did. Yes.
That was
That's right.
a little detail which I enjoyed.
Yes, it was. But this is why you think that she being a psychologist, there are a lot of people in the book, well, each of them really in the book, that have this level of intelligence, and yet when it comes to interpersonal relationships, fail dismally. And it's a kind of a interesting theme to look at overall in the book.
I think that's why the book was so enjoyable, because for me it was almost poking fun at this idea of what's normal. And so he set up this character to be quite unusual with Asperger's and had so much stuff happening in terms of had to be rigid, had to be this, and he was the one that was considered unusual. And yet all these normal people who were having normal relationships were in fact the ones that were doing very disturbing things to each other. And so there was this whole byplay of what he thought was logical and rational and how you do things that then wasn't really. And so for me, this whole idea of, well, what's normal? How different is different? And his idea that, towards the end of this book, you get this sense that he says, well, what I've learned is I really need to fake being like everybody else in order to survive in this world. So I'll be able to fake it. And then he just goes about actively faking it. And so I was going, okay, so all of us probably fake it. We're really a little bit unusual and have to fake it all the time. So for me, those are the sorts of things that came out. And that's why I liked it.
I did enjoy it when there were just a few little spots. I felt I had to almost search to find them, where the word one I've got in my head is twinge. He felt a twinge of something that he wasn't familiar with, as if there was just a gentle changing, an evolution happening in him that he didn't realise was happening, couldn't cope with what it was, didn't understand it, but it wasn't quite so black and white. I found it quite fascinating that you share a taxi because that is far better with the use of fossil fuel. And if he's cooked a dinner and she's sitting there but she doesn't eat that food, he'll eat it because you can't waste food. I mean, that's extremely logical to me. I relate to Don. Don is a very organised gentleman. But he didn't know, he could go out and deal with Asperger's children, but he couldn't see it in himself, a little bit like a psychology student.
Yes, that's right.
I'm okay, what's the matter with the rest of you? I'm operating very efficiently, and he was a very efficient operator.
But extremely dysfunctional.
To your eyes, but not to mine.
He's got to stick up for the male, isn't he?
But could I just add that one where he goes to this restaurant and the restaurant has a rule that says you must wear a coat? And he said, I've got a coat on and it's a Gore-Tex raincoat. And he said, and this costs $300. Well, that makes it okay. I've got a coat on. And, they didn't specify that it had to be, in fact, a jacket. That's right. And this whole byplay around the things that we just take for granted, of all these social norms, that perhaps aren't as normal as we think. So,
and him getting into a fight, which you would never expect really to do. But speaking about the fight, what do you think about him learning the Aikido and becoming sort of, what I guess it was? Do you think that was a compensation for his bullying? Do you think he thought that was going to keep him safe for the rest of his life by learning that? He'd learned it since he was 6, but he still obviously wasn't that proficient with it.
I don't know what to say.
I saw him as being proficient.
He was very proficient, yes.
He got into those two men fairly effectively, I thought.
He didn't lose a single fight.
Channeling Don there, David.
And he dealt with Phil, who was a professional.
Oh, yes,
No, I thought he was very proficient. As everything that he tackled apart from human relationships, he was very good at it.
And Rosie liked him when he stripped down too. I remember she talked about his text. So leave it that lady. Gentlemen, sorry. I read very carefully.
The whole idea of the bullying, though, was very interesting because you sort of see this guy transplanted. He grows up in this country town. He's bullied at school, has a breakdown, and then survives through getting out of there and just channeling and becoming this very structured, rigid person that doesn't have any friends and doesn't interact with the rest of the world because of all of these experiences. And it's almost like he just puts all of that behind. His family means nothing to him. It's all of this stuff, and I found that, and that's why I sort of go, it's an interesting book. It's really interesting about all these things that we just take for granted.
And it's interesting in the fact that we talked about Asperger's as a not normal, but maybe that was just the coping mechanism at that time, was all those rigid structures, and it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with Asperger's, but that was the way of coping from leaving the country town, not having a family to care about at all, except for his sister, and then coming to a place where he knew no one to create friends. He had a rigid way of life.
Well,
yes, it was easier to work on a time clock and on a food clock than deal with the world.
He did have a set of principles that he followed, and one of those was, I can do it if I want to, by learning it through a book. And you know, he learned how to dance, except he forgot about the music, and made a dreadful mess of it. But he also learned all the sexual positions from a book.
With a skeleton.
With a skeleton. Which got him into quite a lot of trouble as well with the Dean. And you know, these things that he did by book, it's funny that he actually went and physically did the Aikido. You know, because you would have thought that maybe he would have just learned that from a book, but he actually went to the Aikido classes. But what are some of the other things that some of the issues that were brought up because of Don's actions?
I was going to say, rather than an issue, what I felt was very interesting was this idea of having a survey to find the perfect wife. And so that you actually design a survey and then filter out all of the things that you don't think you'd want in a life partner or you need to have in a life partner. And that whole construct that you could possibly find this perfect person by doing a survey. And that coming out and then how that all disintegrated and his whole learning experience from that. But for me, as I said, there were just so many interesting little bits that you go, oh, why would you ever think that? And then I'm going to think, what about that speed dating and all of the RSVPs and all those things that go on today? And how different is that to the survey that Don has designed to find?
It's probably not really that different at all, is it? I mean, when you think about it, he asked all the questions that the dating service would ask. And then, but my objection to that was he gave them all to Jean to filter through. And I probably think that might have been a big mistake. just saying, you know.
Well, it gave Jean a whole new list of people that he's going to put on his map.
It may not have been good for Don. That's right, exactly. What about body perception, which was one of the things that it came up a lot with him and his BMI index description of everyone he encountered that was something different. And also the fact that one of the things that I thought of when I was looking at it was he specifically wrote in a question saying that he didn't want to interact with a woman who considered her appearance as an important aspect of herself. And yet, throughout the book, he constantly described women by their boobs or how attractive they were and how stunning they were. She looked gorgeous, didn't know where to look, and and I just found that a little bit of an anomaly. But what are you thinking?
Well, I think that's instinct versus rational thinking, and he thought he was functioning rationally, but as the book goes on, he realises instinct is kicking in a big way, and I suspect this is the first time in his life that he actually had this instinct sort of taking over the rational thinking. So as a geneticist, he recognised the instinct, but just didn't know how to deal with it.
What about you, David?
Yes, I felt there was some, shall we say, scientific, factual type things inserted in the book, and this area is one of them, that he reckoned that he could reproduce successfully. I think that's a quote from the book. I could reproduce successfully. I just have to find her. And when she was around him, he didn't even recognise that she was going to be the future ideal person for him. And I hope I'm not spoiling the story for anyone who hasn't read it yet. That's slipped out, sorry. But he did have what I think I'll say is a natural male thing about observing beauty. And I have a vague recollection, I don't have the quote here, but I think somewhere he did actually use words that I admire beautiful things. Can anyone help me? I just vaguely remember something like that. But anyway, he knew which woman looked good to him and which one didn't. That's guilty. Thank you.
But Lucilla, do you think that this BMI thing, to me that was, it really was very strong with him, wasn't it?
I found it quite fascinating that he described everybody to a BMI, and it was almost to the point of, well, if you weren't within the right, what he deemed the right range, then he wouldn't talk to you. But in the end, through the baseball and going to New York, he actually ended up becoming a really good friend with somebody who was ridiculously at the wrong end of the BMI for Don's right thinking. So I think that also helped him change his perception, so using science and instinct instead. And he continued to create another friend, so he got more fights.
That was almost like a distraction to the book. What on earth did the BMI necessarily have to do with the depth of the story?
Yes, it was a measurement of their mathematical literacy, which was very important. He didn't want a partner who wasn't literate mathematically.
No, and it was about their health.
And
It was their health. So if they weren't within the right BMI range, then they weren't able to have a long life. Therefore, there was no point wasting any time.
But he did quote it for the males too, please. It wasn't just
Yeah,
for
he
the
did.
women.
No, he did.
He checked the blokes out as well.
He did.
But when he went to the homosexual bar, he didn't recognise what was happening. He'd lost the plot bag.
I saw the BMI differently though. It was about fitness and things, but it was actually just how he processed people. It wasn't just about it. Like, yes, the process, it was almost like, I'm introduced to you, your name is such and such, and your BMI, and that's how I've now filed you in my little computer brain around who you are and where you fit in.
As opposed to blue eyes, brown hair.
Yeah, it was just that he just went automatically into blah, 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 blah. And it was just all that. I think the other thing that was interesting for me was when he actually had the meltdown. And he had the meltdown when they were flying back from New York to Australia, and he didn't speak for the length of the flight. And it was almost like he'd had this complete emotional overload, and he wasn't quite sure how to actually cope, and so he shut down. And so it was just these little interesting little insights into, well, what's going on for this guy, and how's he going to come through this, and is he heading for another nervous breakdown, and what will that, how will that all unfold? And in fact it becomes a bit of a light read. We actually get a good solution, a very nice romance at the end and all that sort of stuff. But it was more that it explored those issues for somebody that was dealing with it, and you're going, it could go either way, this book.
I'm going to just pick up a couple of things. I'm going to defend Don briefly again. Rosie questioned him once, and he could tell her the nature of the necklace. And he could tell her the nature of the necklace from the night before. And it was right on. He is observant, as we know many of these people are, and it was just up there. He knew it was restored. I also felt, as I came away from the story, reflecting on the flight back, I wonder whether it is feasible in the time frame we might sense in this book, whether someone with the depth of problems that he seemed to have and the way he could function, whether it can be reversed in a real life situation. It was beautiful for the story to have him develop sensitivities and be able to demonstrate emotion and recognise it in himself. But I wondered how realistic it was. I think it is a very, very drawn out, painful experience. It is only partially controlled to, way, way down the line. So it's lovely to read it working in this case, but I think it's a bit unrealistic.
I actually read a crit along those lines on one of the reviews, just one of these websites where individual readers write reviews, and somebody wrote in and said that they had a relative with Asperger's, and that one of the disappointments for her in the book was just what you're saying, that it's very difficult for somebody with Asperger's, to the extent that he had it, to actually change so fundamentally so quickly, and she was quite depressed about it. In fact, she felt that was very unrealistic, and it was giving the public at large the wrong impression of Asperger's.
Yeah, Graeme gave us little clues. He used little clues that things were starting to change for Don, that he was sensing things, he didn't know what they were, but what on earth happened then, and it didn't just go bang at the end. I think it was just opened up piece by piece right throughout the book.
Yes, certainly. I think one of the ways that he learned to change himself was with his relationship with Daphne. And that was one of the relationships that redeemed him a little bit in my eyes, in that he knew that it was such an important thing to her to have the flowers on her birthday, and that she was coming up to this next birthday, and that because of her husband's illness, that would not happen. And and then he got to
And he
do
kept
over
it
over.
up, and
That's
in
right.
fact, if you did the arithmetic, which was there in the book, he
Yes.
visited her for hundreds of times,
Yes, this is very
which I
significant.
found absolutely fascinating. Yes,
Because she got to the point where she didn't know when her birthday was.
So he was going more or less every day
That's
with the
right.
Daphne. Yes,
Yeah.
and the number of times was phenomenal.
That was very redeeming for me. What's another redeeming factor for him?
His relationship with his sister. I think the reason he maybe clung on to Daphne was the fact that he lost that one other person other than Jean and Claudia. That was his touchstone, so he needed a new touchstone, and Daphne happened to be persistent in making sure that he was doing the right thing. So I think it filled a void at the time, and maybe Rosie did the same at the start. So because Daphne had then been lost, so that Rosie was, and the Life Project was even out of that because Daphne had said, you can find someone, there is someone out there. So I think that was a very interesting take on. He just needed to have those people continuously in.
I also thought it was rather sweet that he went into that shop and bought the scarf for Claudia with some help from Rosie, which he didn't need. But the scarf was $1,000 and something. And I thought that was, and he didn't blush. I thought that was enchanting that he cared that much about Claudia. He was quite happy to spend that amount of money on it. That was a lovely little touch in the book, I must
But
say.
he nearly bought the one with the birds of the world on it. I think too, fairly obviously, is it true that one other redeeming thing for Don was just the fact he took on the Rosie Project. He took it on for Rosie's benefit to find out what he wanted to find out for her. And that's a fairly big leap, even if he was trained in that area. There's no great burden to him. From where he stood as an Asperger's person, I think that's a fairly generous gift to her. So just the project itself, I think, was a good feather in his cap.
I guess one of the things that also appealed to me was the when he learned how to make all the cocktails, that function. And he became like, the Brian Brown and Tom Cruise in cocktail. He was, they were throwing all these orders at him, and he was, doing, I can imagine him tossing up the cocktail shaker and doing all that. To me, again, that was another kind of a quirky little redeeming thing, because that's a bit that I saw a lot of humour in that he was this man who was totally inept at social conversation and even didn't like to touch or be in close proximity to other human beings. All of a sudden became the star of the show at this function, because he actually, not only did he know all the cocktails, but he perceived that it was going to be the best way to solve the problem, and with Rosie's help, and he got behind the bar and started doing it all. I thought that was lovely. I really enjoyed that bit.
And I felt for the manager of the bar who said, "Would you like to go into business with me?"
A little bit far-fetched.
That's really true.
Also, about we talked a little bit about the bullying. Was there any other characters, do you feel, that were subject to bullying?
Probably the head of the school, the dean of the school, in that and that whole relationship. There was one student that Don was going to actually not pass, and there was this whole dilemma around when Don gets into trouble for doing this research project that he really shouldn't have done on university premises, that he then gets sort of discussed with how does it feel for him to be in that position, and how does the student feel to have his last chance. And so the bullying that went on with that student around, and I don't think Don would have perceived that he was actually doing the bullying, but the way that he treated some of his students was actually in a very harassing, bullying way, because he was so unaware of the impact that he was having on how those students behaved and what happened. So just the way the tables were turned towards the end, when the dean was able to actually turn it into, well, you've got a choice here. If you want to continue to have an academic career, you're going to have to work with this student and work out something, and how do you feel about that? And that whole the manipulating, and then how he actually put himself in the shoes of that student and said, okay, well, you actually knew everything, why did you do that? And just how that whole situation unfolded. So there's a lot of little bits of bullying coming out through a whole range of characters, even his brother, the way his brother treated him, and there was just a range of this.
Yes, or yes.
And his father, so
Yes,
his,
his father too.
he seemed to talk about the relationship with his sister. His mother wasn't talked about much at all, but his father and his brother were basically bullies because they were similar, so they did everything together, so it's kind of left out that.
Well, they picked on him, didn't they? You know,
did.
and there was, of course, the revelation that he that he thought he had just made to them, saying that he was actually straight when they obviously had thought that he was gay all of this time because of the fact that he had no female relationships. So yes, certainly I can see some bullying there.
On the subject of bullying, I thought it was interesting when he remembered the time at the end of his primary school career, I think it was, when that religious instruction teacher bullied him and he was hauled over the coals by the headmaster. In fact, that was the first year of high school because that set him off on being the class buffoon. That was a turning point for him. And then when he has his reflective moments, he thinks about the time of when he showed the student the flounder. Do you remember that? That the student who was questioning his theories and bringing in creationism was suddenly, several weeks later, long after the student had forgotten about it, I'm sure, suddenly presented with a smelly flounder as an illustration of how believing in an intelligent creator was silly. But and so Don himself sort of recognised, questioned that. He suddenly realised, gee, I must have been bullying the student, and I thought that was interesting.
Yes.
Yet his actions at the time were fairly pure. He had to explain to this student where he stood in religion versus science, and he went about it in a practical way. He knew this would demonstrate the fact. He just forgot that the fish got smelly over 2 weeks, but he still wanted to present his fact. And there's the student, it's time to tell you now, I've got the fish, and away we go. What else do? You help your students, you teach. And that's all very admirable.
I think you might be identifying with Jonathan.
I also noticed, talking about the father, there was a little line where they said, Dad had his chair, always Dad's chair, and I had mine. And I wonder, we're back to that environment type thing, what was it that sent him where he ended up? Did it start in the home? Through examples, what was Dad like on other matters? Was it just the only evidence we got that we all had our chair? And it just developed into all the other things like my recipes and my cupboard of food and everything else.
Do you think that he called everything a project? Do you think that was his coping mechanism? Because everything had to be in some sort of order, as we discussed before.
It made it much more structured.
It absolutely made it structured.
It gave him a
Calling it
framework.
project.
It gave him a framework to cope. Because projects must have a plan and then a coping strategy and then a summary at the end. You know. So once he'd got his framework, he could then take on the problem.
He just needed ethics approval for every project.
Which he forgot.
Well, I'll just ask for a last word from each of our panellists, and then we'll open it up and perhaps take some questions from the audience. So a last word from yourself.
I really liked Tessa's comment before that it was a really light read. It was a really light read, and it was very enjoyable. And as I said, for me, it just said so many things around, as I said before, what's normal and what's different, and who judges that. And probably we judge a bit too much and not really think about the other person. So it fitted really neatly for me in that sense.
I think I'm probably along the same lines. It's about celebrating the differences. Like that was what I enjoyed out of it. So seeing all those quirky little things that people do and just taking them on board and celebrating them because everybody's a little bit different.
Yes, despite the fact I said at the beginning that I had some misgivings, I did enjoy it. Having worked in a university environment, I enjoyed meeting up with some characters I used to work with, so to speak. I thought it was fun. As I said at the beginning, I did have some issues with the plot. I think it got a bit contrived, and I think he rushed the ending. But I think the fact that we've been able to discuss it happily for half an hour, and no doubt will continue to do so, shows that it had a lot in it.
David?
I just repeat, I had troubles with it. I grew into it. I did hear the other day on the radio, one of the book shows on the radio, a lady expressed the fact that she reads books to gain insight into relationships and circumstances that will occur in her life. And I find I did the same. I realised, it was like, oh wow, that light bulb came on. And I felt that in here I had a few things that caught my eye. There was a quote from Don, I'm accustomed to creating amusement inadvertently. I have some very embarrassing memories in that line. So, yeah. And then there was just a couple of other things, and I'll be very careful here. Act more conventionally, it's unusual for a scientist. To act more conventionally, that's unusual for a scientist. Something quite sweet to think about there. I claim to be a science degree, and yes. And then, do you know how to relax? How to just have fun? Do I? Do you? Do I know how to relax and just have fun? That was a big struggle for Don. And as he slowly mastered with Rosie's help, I think that was a great blessing for him to receive from her. But I think it's a skill that I and everyone else in my world needs to have. And I'll leave it with this, why don't people just say what they mean?
Yes, indeed. I think that, as I said, that I found it very hard to like Don, but there were those redeeming moments which endeared him in some way to me. And of course, I thought Rosie, I actually quite admired Rosie and the way she was fairly straight shooter and was fairly certain of what she wanted and thought she knew how to get it. But she'd probably never come across anyone quite like Don before. And even though she didn't really give in to, I guess, changing the way she reacted to things in life, she tried to kind of adjust slightly to the left to him, but then she thought, oh, bugger it, basically. And she just went, no, I'm going to keep going the way I'm going. And in the end, I think that was what was good for Don in the first place, was the fact that she was so completely different. And, of course, obviously not anywhere possibly the wife project material. And I think that's probably also a factor that redeemed him, because you realise that eventually, that it didn't really matter. So we'll open it up now, I think, to people in the audience, and if you have a specific question for a particular panellist, or if you would just like to, any one of them, I can direct any one of them. I'll try not to put them on the spot too much, but... so has anyone got a question? Yes? Yes, go ahead.
I'm interested to know whether the panel feels that every novel that's successful must have one character who's growing. If there's no movement in the internal workings of the character, is it going to be a successful novel or not?
Did everyone hear that? Yes? Who wants to tackle that one? Anyone in particular? Go on, big game.
With a cold start, I guess I'm going to say yes, I agree, especially what I closed off with. Yet I'm sure I can pick books that I've read, and I cannot call one at the moment, that maybe counter it. Recently I read The Light Between Seas, and Between Oceans, thank you. And that was definitely about tremendous turmoil for some individuals, and there was a form of growth there. Turmoil for those individuals with what was put upon them and how they made choices and the ramifications of those choices. And I found that a powerful book. So maybe I lean towards books where there is a character who has a chance to grow. I'm talking too long. Thank you for your question.
Does anyone else have any opinions on that?
I was going to say, generally speaking, I think the books that I'm more attracted to is that there is some character development. Now, I generally read crime fiction. Okay, and so I say that I really love it. But the ones that I've loved the most, even in crime, which is just situational mostly, is one where you see that the character actually has a character that develops. It's not just solving the crime, that they learn something through doing it. So as a generalisation, I'd go, yeah, most of the books that I think are really worth reading is because you see them growing and learning or changing or doing, responding or something. And I think that's what you then reflect on for yourself and go, are you learning, growing, continuing to develop? So sometimes it's just that, having the mirror and feeling like you're actually growing yourself by having, in fact, read something that's a bit different. So, yes.
I'm jumping here. I prefer to read biographies and autobiographies. And in that respect, I think I grow, along with the people who the book is about or who have written the book. They don't necessarily sometimes grow because you can see that they talk about the failures and misgivings, and some of them are not very redeemable characters. If they're criminals or that sort of thing that you're reading. But the strength of the writing is usually in that it will teach me something. And if it teaches me something, then I'm growing, and I guess that's kind of a symbiotic thing that happens between the novelist and the reader. Any other questions? Is that giving you a good enough answer?
Yes.
Yes.
For those of us who haven't read the book, what was the project that was helping Rosie?
Rosie was under the belief that...
Was Rosie the project?
No, the project was the father project. So Rosie was of the belief that her father wasn't her father. Because her mother had said that her father wasn't her father. So she was of this understanding that somebody within her mother's medical student class was her father. So the project was going through a DNA process of all the people in the medical class to discover who the father was.
Yeah, because he was a geneticist, he was able to help her with the appropriate help of DNA.
But he had to cancel his wife project so he could do the father project, which was Rosie's project.
Which has reminded me as I made a faux pas earlier when I said he redeemed himself by taking on the Rosie Project. He took on the Father Project,
yes.
And he didn't realise the Rosie Project was underlying everything.
That's right.
And that was my slip earlier. Thank you for the correction. Good question.
Anyone else got another question? Can we ask? Yes, lady in red.
I felt Don and Rosie were the most normal people in the book. Because they said exactly what they thought, and the others were hiding behind a lot of history. Jean especially was, he had no morals whatsoever and hid behind this open marriage that Claudia initially felt was right, but then she didn't want it, but he continued on. I just felt those two were amazingly normal.
Would you agree? There's some normality there as opposed to
To
something
the
else?
extreme, let me say. To the extreme in Don's case.
No, I don't think anybody was really normal. I mean, who is? And I'm normal. I think Don was probably sort of normal that most of us don't recognise or understand. But I think we're all abnormal on a huge spectrum. I think one of the problems for me in the book is that you only saw the world through Don's eyes, so it was a very, very filtered world. And I think some of the characters just weren't developed properly. I think Jean was a bit of a caricature. He didn't come across as a real person, so I don't feel qualified to really comment on Jean as a person. And we only saw snippets of him.
I kind of wish I was a little bit like Don in his organisational skills. His timing of everything, how I program his life out, that would make my life so much better. So maybe he was a little bit normal.
But then, of course, you'd have someone come along like Rosie who would move his clock and set him all up, and then he'd try and put her in a cab and say it was cheaper after midnight, when of course it was nowhere near midnight. Way afterwards. Sorry, there was a lady up the back there. So.
This is more a comment, probably. I loved it from the very first page. I think there is a little bit of Asperger's in my family, not bad enough to be kind of like medically examined, but I could see rigidity in some of Don that I recognise in myself, particularly as I get older. And I thought there was full character development. It was the most unusual book. And I just also wanted to say that I thought the BMI was a comedic device similar to Bridget Jones's alcohol units.
I thought you were going to say her knickers. And sorry. Yes.
I just want to make a comment. My favourite little part in the book was the lobster dinner. And how he could afford to eat both parts and then he wouldn't have any alcohol.
Of course, that's another thing that he put in the questionnaire, wasn't it? That the moderate, first of all, it was no alcohol. And then, of course, when Bianca came along and said, no, neither of us are drinking, he kind of went, huh? And then he realised he should change that to moderate alcohol consumption, but I think he drank quite a bit.
And then he said he was an alcoholic. It worked out he was actually an alcoholic. Only when he was experimenting with cocktails.
Do you think that, I love the book, it was absolutely wonderful, so much enjoyed it out of it. But do you think that someone that had a child with Asperger's or a relation with Asperger's might be a twinge offended by the light-hearted attack on it, and how it could be changed? Because I did think the ending was a bit sort of rushed and unreal, because I do know people with Asperger's. Do you think anybody could be offended with it? I would hate to think that they would be, but do you think...
Well, this is something that Tessa touched on earlier, that
I certainly read one comment along those lines. So this was just on the internet, but one reader I think was a bit put out by the book. She felt it was an unreal portrayal of a very serious condition.
of course, it's called a spectrum because it is such a wide-ranging number of effects and the way it presents itself in people. So, yes, it would have. I don't know enough about the top end, shall we say, or the bottom end, to know how much it would offend or how many people along the spectrum it would offend.
Do you think it changed from quite rigid in his planning and thinking his time, which is wonderful, but towards the end he seems to basically...
Threw it all out the window to a point. Yes.
Can I just answer that?
Yes.
I have children with Asperger's, and I think what a lot of everyone's missing here is that whilst it's a diagnosis, whilst it's a spectrum, and there's varying degrees of it on the spectrum, it's like it's just they just haven't learned a skill, and once they've been taught, it's like learning to do your shoelaces. It's just they just need to understand or to learn that skill. Then they've got that for life. But in saying that, it can change on an hourly basis. It can change on a daily basis. You can have great days. You can have bad days. You can have absolutely ecstatic days where they're jumping around everywhere because everything's going great. The human part I get, because they do that to get through. That's what they do.
You could see humour in it.
Yeah.
You are comfortable.
Yeah, but I can understand what you're saying. But remember, he's not grown up with anyone that's provided him with that level of comfort. Everyone's on about Jean and Claudia. They were his teachers, and it was through his 2:30, in the morning phone calls and Claudia teaching him things and being the mother, so to speak, and helping him understand these emotions and watching Jean be Jean and setting him up to fail. I get that, because a lot of Asperger people have that friend. There's always going to be one in their social. That's just, I don't know why, but they attract it. I do understand, and I can see that I don't see it as disappointing. I can see it as he could possibly have learnt those things. It was a whole new thing. It's love. He had great people supporting him through it. Claudia, really. He had Rosie, who intrigued him, and he was learning as a result of it all. So it is possible, but it's not a cure. And I'm just interested to find out, from anyone else's perspective, have they actually changed their perspective with people that have Asperger's? From reading the book? From reading the book. Have you got a better understanding of these people? Whether they be children or, the screaming children in the shopping centres that have just had the meltdown. They don't clam up, they don't be quiet, they scream. Or the adults that appear absolutely rude and obnoxious, but they're not. They just don't have any more room in their heads to cope with anymore. So I'd like to know if anyone's changed their perspective or actually researched more into what Asperger's is.
Could I just say, I was going to say, I think it actually helped understand, because I have actually worked with somebody that had it, and I found it very difficult to work with this person. And it's really by actually understanding more that I got that they were different, and the things that I would have thought were just normal, they just didn't get.
Yeah.
And so it was, for me, that's why I had a chuckle, because it was actually reflecting back and going, oh yeah, and just that understanding. So I think you're right, and that's why I would hope that people that had experience with it wouldn't be offended, because for me it just opened up that world of understanding that I probably wouldn't have got otherwise.
See, I just saw it because it says that his relationship with his family wasn't great. He obviously didn't have the support and that network that he needed when he was younger. Obviously, when he's moved to the city and he's got his routine down pat, and he's got his two support networks, because that's what he needed, that have helped him along the way. And because every problem that he came to, he went back to them. So they were like his therapists.
I think it was almost like they were filtering for him, and he hadn't had those filters provided.
I think the author really described the feelings of somebody with this condition extremely well, and particularly what you described as this concept of meltdown, and the fact that all this information eventually just becomes too much. And I thought that was very sensitively done, and it's certainly, speaking from my point of view, yes, it's increased my internal understanding, my empathy for what people must be feeling like inside.
They go through great lengths every day.
It must be exhausting.
Children,
yes.
To be a part of normal life.
Yes, and it must be very exhausting for everybody. And that comes across, that overwhelming sense that people without that just will just ride through. Not everybody does, and we all feel overwhelmed, but I think a greater understanding of how you just reach that capacity, and that's it. There's no more you can deal with, and that was very sensitively done.
Quite some time back I read a J.D. Picoult book called House Rules, and it was a similar topic handled quite differently. I'm not going to go into what the story is about, it's off my head at the moment, I'm too focused here, but if you wish to pursue this subject further, it is still just a novel, it is not anything other than that, but a very different undertaking. But I still came out feeling I had gained some knowledge of what it would be like to live that life and be in the family.
There's another book, I think it's called The Mysterious Case of the Dog in the Night.
The Curious Incident.
Yes. And I felt I learned a lot from that book.
Sorry, there's a lady at the back with a question. Lady at the back.
Yes.
Yes.
Didn't you, I would have been interested, one, to know what Graeme Simsion's background in Asperger's was. I wondered if any of the panel knew how he knew so much about Asperger's. I think that it's wonderful that he made Asperger's so comedic. I thought it was lovely, that quirkiness. But for me, the disappointment was that there wasn't a quirky end. I thought all of that beautiful quirkiness and comedic value at the beginning was squashed in the end, because he forfeited everything to go with what everyone would believe is the happy ending, and I was disappointed by that. And I wondered whether you thought about whether the survey and the modification of the survey, even though it's a scientific process, was a metaphor for how he was slowly changing, because he was prepared to change his survey in order to fit in with the environment as he went and changed himself.
I think that people, are always willing to change something to mould it to what other people
Not
might.
Asperger's.
No. But
so, that's what struck me, that he was changing his survey as he wanted it to change to suit the people he was with.
Well, that's right, but he was moulding it towards who next he came upon. So it was almost like with each person that he encountered, he was willing to make one change.
I sort of saw it a little bit differently. I actually saw it as a logical progression. That he rationalised and said he'd learned something new, so he modified the survey in light of what the empirical evidence now told him. So it wasn't so much that he was learning from somebody else that this is what I need to adapt to get. It was more that, I found another scientific fact, and the scientific fact leads me to go to this. Not so much.
Was it scientific?
In his brain it was. That's whether it was or not, it didn't matter. That's how he had rationalised that he needed to modify the survey. So for me, it was a very scientific approach that he said, you know, I've designed the survey, as I've got a little bit more information, I've done my theory, I'm now testing my theory by doing this. Oh, I've learned something that says I have to change my theory a bit. So I changed my theory a bit. It was very rational, very logical, like this. It was Don logic, but it's also, to me, a little bit scientific. It's the whole framework that scientists go through with research projects. They have a theory, they want to test it, they do a little bit of testing, they then go back and modify the theory or support the theory and say, now it's fact. You know, that's the scientific way of, and for me it was just, in fact, what a geneticist would do.
Yes.
I really, really enjoyed the book. I just laughed and laughed for probably the first half. I found it also quite a sad book, but an incredibly clever book, because the author looked at so many different issues. The disdain which that group of doctors were going to treat the waiters and so on, and their realisation, oh, it wasn't stupid. I mean, you see that so much in society. I thought that was very clever. I think with Rosie, that first meal, when she changed everything, it was a bit like Chicken Little and thought the sky would fall, and it didn't. And all the other things that she did, which were sort of spontaneous, just sort of made me realise that, you know, there wasn't another way. But I don't think he lost all his sort of characteristics, because remember, right towards the end, she says, I'll need a minute to think about it, and he sets his watch. These little things are still there. It's the fact that the guy in the States offered him a job, pure research, when he didn't have to deal with deans who were worried about funding, and he didn't have to worry about students who he thought should fail. They were catering for him, for a lot of his characteristics, which probably didn't change. Yeah. I thought it was a great book. I really
Can I have a show of hands for anyone who hasn't read the book? From tonight's panel discussion, are you going to have show of hands now of who's going to read it?
Our job is done then.
Okay, well,
It's a book club set.
yes, that's right. They've now got a book club set. It's now time for the advertisement. Yes, they're all part of the book club set, and we obviously encourage everyone to keep reading and to join the book club if you can, because these are sort of discussions you can have in a mini version in your book clubs, and it's a frank way of finding out whether or not you might enjoy a book if you maybe never even thought of reading that particular book, as I said, perhaps not have continued with this one. But you do read it because it's in the book club and that's the chosen one, and it just makes you perhaps, I don't know, enlarge your scope of what you might look for in the future, but it also makes a great healthy discussion, and I'd encourage you all to keep reading.
Thank you.